Hello, this is Virtual the Chess Noob, learning and having fun with chess. I'm participating in the Team Australia 2022 Australia Day tournament and will be presenting some of my games. The tournament uses the daily format with up to 3 days per move, basically like correspondence chess. I'm in Division 3 with player ratings up to 1150. These are the first two of my completed games of round one of my group, and I managed to secure 2 wins. In a very real way, these victories came out of the power of the passed pawn. Please enjoy. All right, let's have a look at the first game. So review first. I did reasonably well in this game, about 80%, and my opponent had about 70% accuracy. And as you can see, I did okay from the beginning and sort of maintained the lead. So good number of good moves, and opponent had some pretty good moves as well. Luckily, I had fewer inaccuracies and mistakes. So let's now move on to the analysis. All right, so I had the white pieces in this game and opponent black, very nice chap. We had a little bit of chat during the game. I play e4 as I usually do. My opponent responded with e5 and I played knight c3, so beginning of the Vienna game. Opponent played d6. I immediately decided to strike for the center with d4. So given that this is basically defended, so basically asking the question, are they going to trade? Opponent, however, plays f6. So very interesting structure, creating sort of a little pyramid. Now, I have to admit, I'm not too sure whether or not this is the best opening, given that it does sort of block in the knight and it sort of blocks in one of the bishops. Now, Stockfish wasn't so keen on this, with sort of +2 to white, and sort of recommended trading, I think, right away. And that was actually what I expected. I here decided to be a little bit cheeky and play f4 as well, so 3 pawns in the center. And the opponent now played knight e7, and I have to appreciate the geometry here, and remember these are like foot soldiers, so the pawns creating a little defensive defensive blockade for the opponent, and with the knight behind that blockade, ready to strike out. So I have to admit, there is a degree of geometric beauty here. I played my other knight, so knight f3. Opponent played bishop g4, pinning my knight to the queen, so good move. I played bishop e2, so unpinning that knight. Opponent now plays f5, so pushing things forward. Now, I knew that at a certain point it probably is good to crack open the center, but with my king still in the center of the board, I sort of opted not to do that. So after that move, I thought that bishop didn't have a lot of places to go. So I played h3 to sort of ask the question on what they were going to do with that bishop. So apparently sort of the f-pawn capture would put me significantly ahead. But I find it quite difficult to work out when is the best time to sort of crack open the center with pawns. The opponent played bishop h5, so retreating the bishop rather than taking. Here I decided to capture. When I counted it, it seemed okay. I expected them to capture back, to be honest. And by making that move, now that allows me to capture the other pawn back. So now I did expect that the knight will push forward, but here I'm potentially quite a bit ahead. I now push the pawn g4, forking the 2 pieces. Opponent plays well, so playing knight g3 with an attack on the rook. So rook g1. That capture was expected, but I'm okay with that. Capturing with the queen, so developing the queen potentially with that move. So I was fairly happy with the opening and what's happened. So the opponent has a bishop, but that's sort of caught on the side of the board. All the other pieces are still in the back rank. Pawns, they've lost some pawns, so I'm 1 pawn up, and I've got some developed pawns and some developed pieces. Opponent plays bishop g6, which makes sense. Need to get out of there with being attacked by a pawn. However, now I had sort of a queen with check. Opponent played knight d7 to block, and here that pawn is now the passed pawn and potentially quite strong. On the 6th rank, now 2 attackers. Opponent plays queen e7, and here I actually make a mistake. What I should have done is just to have liquidated, accept that to force a trade of queen. So capture, that's forced, capture. So I would sort of gain a trade a knight for a pawn. We both lose our queens, end up sort of a queenless middle game, but that's probably actually okay. That's probably okay. Instead, I thought I would be, be a little bit clever by playing knight e5. Thinking that there is an extra attacker here. That's actually not a good move, because queen can straight up capture that pawn, and once the pawn is captured, the queen pins the knight against the king. So that is why that is a substantial mistake. My opponent, however, opts to long castle rather than make that move. And here, with that being a passed pawn, it's attacking. It now allows me to capture that piece, and it comes with check. And so captures, and here I decide to liquidate. So capture with queen, forcing a queen trade, and basically now also getting a rook for a knight. So, and pawn at the end. So at the end, I'm left with knight and bishop and 2 rooks. Opponent still has the bishop pair and a rook. That rook is a bit out of the picture at the moment, but my rook is a bit out of the picture here as well, not really developed. Now the opponent does have a bishop pair, and bishop pairs often are quite powerful in this part of the game, so I do need to still play very carefully. So opponent captures that pawn back. I wanted to start to open up the space to try to develop that rook, potentially with attack. Opponent plays a good move, bishop d6, and you will see here that the opponent actually coordinates their bishops quite well. So I'm forced to now block the check, which of course means that the knight is pinned to the king. The opponent hightails their light square bishop out of attack, which was a good move. Here I decided to play rook f1, thinking potentially I'll be able to sort of block that sort of attack, and also just taking control of the open file. The Stockfish thinks that moving the king out of the line of the rook was a better move in this instance. So bishop g3 with check. Now I can move the king out of the way. Again, still pinned, but now the king is providing defense to those 2 pieces. Opponent now pushes their h-pawn to h5. And here capturing I thought was going to be a mistake, because they'll capture back and that will come with check, so that's not good. Instead, I thought, yeah, actually, let's move the king out of the line. Out of that line. That's already defended by the bishop. Now I have a capacity to move the knight. Opponent plays h4, which probably doesn't achieve very much, unfortunately for them. And now I had this fairly powerful move. Knight f5 attacks that bishop, attacks that pawn, and if I take that pawn, also comes with an attack on the rook. So that is potentially a very good move. If they capture, more than happy to liquidate pieces, because I'm a piece ahead. I want to move towards a potential endgame. Opponent now makes probably a mistake. So this was a mistake because I now can capture, and it comes with a discovered attack on the bishop as well. However, before I made that move, I thought I would protect that pawn by moving that pawn up, so that doesn't become a potential attack. So that line doesn't become an attack. Opponent tries to attack my knight with the pawn, unfortunately missing that move. So there's an attack, and realistically the opponent has to lose a piece. They captured back my knight, I suppose thinking that they were going to push that pawn. No, it is a passed pawn now, so I do have to be careful. However, that comes with check. So check. the opponent decides to trade pieces. Now the opponent only has king and pawns, while I have bishop and rook. So I should be okay. And from my perspective, I shouldn't have a problem with preventing that pawn from promoting. So simply, if I move the king out of the way, the rook commands the back rank. Also, potentially, the bishop can go there, and then if the pawn moves out of the way, it can go there, defending that square. So I sort of move the bishop out of the way. The opponent pushes their pawn to g2, so that makes sense. However, now I've got king out of the way, so basically promotion is not possible. The opponent sort of brings their king forward. I bring my pawn forward to h4, and this basically now is like a force field. So it is not possible for the king to enter onto the 5th rank. They play c6, which makes sense. I move the king over. Basically, let's just remove that threat once and for all. The opponent to move the king out, moves this way. I expected they were probably trying to come over here, given that this is completely blocked to them. Capture that pawn. Now very safe. Here, bring the bishop forward, and this arrangement, a pawn and a bishop, basically is completely invulnerable to attack by a king. The opponent continues to move their king. Here I decided to play b4 because if they attack here, I wanted to be able to prevent that attack because this pawn should be able to become promoted and that square is protected by the bishop. So promotion should be unavoidable. But the king sort of moves away from potentially preventing promotion anyway, so it doesn't really make much of a difference. Push the pawn, captures. That one's going to move ahead now. King sort of, I suppose, makes an attack on the rook, but now rook can come here, and that is unavoidable now. So there's no way these pawns can promote. That pawn will definitely become a queen. And here my opponent opted to resign. So good game to opponent, GG. Now let's have a look at the second game. So review of the second game. In this game, I played reasonably well as well. Again, very friendly opponent. We had a little bit of a chat during the game. I played okay, I suppose, about 76%, opponent 60%. And in this game, I think I played reasonably accurately. The opponent did have one blunder, and I did manage to do, as I said, quite well in the game. Now let's move on to the analysis. All right, so I played with the black pieces in this game, an opponent white. They led with e4, I played e5, knight f3, I played knight c6. So basically the beginning of the Italian and the guaco piano game. And as per some of my sort of other sort of videos, I don't really like playing the guaco piano as black. I just find it's the closed game, the tension, this just gets to me. So after they short castled and I sort of basically finished off my development with sort of knight f6, opponent played d3, and here I knew that the best move was probably d6. However, I thought that I wanted at this point to actually shake things up. So I straight up played d5. So just to immediately crack open the center. I knew that this wasn't as good as d6, but potentially playing this line, like we would open up some lines, and I thought that maybe my opponent would be a little bit less familiar with this sort of aggressive sort of push, even though it's effectively almost like gambiting because white is straight up ahead with that move. Let's see what happens. So captures, which makes sense. I capture back. So not so easy for the opponent to immediately capture back because I've now opened up that line. That knight is defended by the queen. Opponent plays bishop b5, which was interesting. That was a sort of interesting move. I immediately develop my bishop to g4, so bishop g4, pinning that knight to the queen, and we'll see that ends up being pretty good for me over this game. Opponent plays c4 with sort of attack on the knight. I sort of bring my knight backwards, so knight e7, so providing an extra defender to the knight. I expect that the opponent might actually capture there, and I wanted to then maintain defense of that pawn. a3, I play a6, asking the question of what are they going to do with that light square bishop. They capture as expected, capture back. And at this point, I'm fairly happy. I thought I was probably doing well out of this opening. Opponent plays bishop at g5, and interesting enough, this was apparently a really problematic move. I actually thought this was a pretty good move by the opponent, and the reason why Stockfish thinks that this is not a good move is that bishop is of course defended only by the knight, and so I could remove the defender by capturing, which then, of course, places the opponent's queen in attack. So we're both potentially going to trade queens. And in this position, it would make most sense for the opponent to capture my knight, and then I capture my bishop, sorry, and then I capture their bishop. But in capturing, I end up capturing knight and bishop. They only capture my bishop, so I end up being a piece up. So that move actually leads to a loss of material for white. Now, I didn't see that. So what I did instead was I brought bishop back to e7, blocking the attack, threatening to take as well. So they capture, I capture back, and this pin continues. Opponent plays knight bd2, so providing an extra defender to that knight. So I thought that was a pretty good move. I now long castles, and by long castling, I thought this gave me an opportunity to really try to potentially push the attack on the king's side, because I don't have to worry so much about defense on this side. Opponent plays d4. However, I thought that was a straight up blunder. Well, Stockfish called it a mistake, and the reason for that is that that's not defended, basically, because I could basically capture back for one thing, and of course, that knight remains pinned. They can't do anything about it. So that's a straight up hanging pawn, and that now allows me to lift so my rook into the game, and also allows me to potentially bring the other rook centered as well, forming a battery. So I thought this was very good for me. Opponent plays queen e1. Okay, moving it out of the pin. I decide at this point to, given the pin is lost, straight up capture the knight, and potentially I was hoping if they did that, that would now open up a weakness in front of the king. However, they played the right move, and I suppose that was pretty obvious. Yep, capture with knight, attack on the rook, but there was a hanging pawn there as well. That's a sort of good move. So attack the rook. So forced to move the rook a second time. However, I thought this potentially is good. Opponent plays rook d1, so centralizing their other rook. Here, I thought I'd better add an extra defender to that pawn. The two attackers. So extra defender now with a pawn. So pawn defending pawns is often good. Because you can't just willy-nilly capture, because obviously happy to trade a pawn for a piece. And now a battery of the rook and queen. And here I saw a number of potential strategies. So opponent sort of moves sort of queen to e2, which I didn't necessarily think was the best move. I think potentially maybe the opponent was thinking of forming a battery on their own right. Now here I thought this looked like a really logical move. Because it sort of basically attacks the queen, also attacks the bishop, the knight. So I thought that was a pretty forcing move that would make the sort of knight captures knight, and then I would probably be able to capture back in that manner. However, I thought that if we keep doing this, we'll end up being reasonably equal. I thought, I am sort of +2, a couple of pawns up, but one mistake on my part and I could lose that advantage. So I thought I would play a somewhat more dangerous line, which was to push the pawn to e4, which now has an attack on that knight as well. Opponent played queen c4, which was interesting. I decided to move the knight now. So we have got this attack now. So they capture, and I capture back with queen. Now that provides an extra defense, so I thought potentially they form a battery this way. That allows me to protect that square. Opponent plays again a sort of move that sort of surprised me a little bit. Queen f7. Fundamentally, I don't mind because this sort of push, moving the pawn up, getting it towards the to the 6th and 7th rank would be potentially very powerful. If they don't do something about that, that of course comes with check. That could potentially go up a second time, forking the 2 rooks. So I thought that was potentially very powerful for me. So E3. So even though Stockfish didn't like the initial push, now that it's there, it's looking pretty good. The opponent sort of does a check. I thought that was fine for me because I could just move the king out of the way. Of course, that's a forced move, but there's not a lot they can do. If they capture, happy to trade. They can't go here. If they capture there, again, I've got that sort of powerful move the next turn potentially. Now they move their rook out of the way, so obviously that move no longer works. However, I now have that which comes with check. So very powerful, very powerful. And basically the opponent here is in some serious problems. So they either, if they capture, I calculate that was going to be a checkmate line. Their best move was probably to move the king out of the way. But even in doing so, there are sort of high chances I could create a checkmate type scenario with the king sort of stuck on the back rank. So power of the passed pawn. So at this point, it is now a passed pawn. And, with it right there, the opponent is forced to trade a rook for a pawn. And here, check, and there, either of those moves is checkmate. And I decide to checkmate with queen. So it was another good game, showing the power of trying to push a pawn towards the end, especially if it's supported. Good game, GG. The unassuming pawn becomes much more valuable when it is passed, unopposed by an opponent's pawn. Although we think of pawns as the weakest piece, the context on the board is important. Passed pawns block the progress of other pieces, threatens what's in front of them, and often when it gets to the final couple of ranks, need to be traded with sacrifices lest it gets to the final rank and promotes to a queen. From that perspective, supporting your own passed pawns and making sure that the opponent's passed pawns are properly defended are important strategic considerations. I hope you enjoyed this video and thanks for watching.